distinguished guests. Welcome back for session 2. Whenever the Eurasian Media Forum announces the various topics for discussing each year, I find myself thinking there were so many major events taking place this year across the world. And then each year seems to be more dramatic than the previous year in terms of world events. Now, perhaps it's just the way someone like me thinks because I work in the media, but there's no doubt, and I think everyone would agree, that what happened over the past year and a half is something that no one could have foreseen. The whole world shutting down because of the virus pandemic. So naturally, it's a topic that has to be discussed at this forum. So session 2 is entitled, How the Pandemic Has Changed the World and Redefined New Paths to Global Coexistence. And I'm pleased to invite the moderator for this session to the stage, the award-winning broadcaster and journalist and my very dear friend, Ryan Chillcote.
Baraklarınızga salam. My name is Ryan Chillcote. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Rish. And if you're joining us today at this forum, welcome just joining us at the forum today, welcome to Nur Sultan and the second panel of the day of the 17th edition of the Eurasian Media Forum. I want to remind you, this isn't a one-way conversation. Everyone online is a participant in today's conversation. So send your questions our way via the platform, and we and the unflappable Sue Phillips will relay those questions to our esteemed panelists. Indeed, 4 of our panelists today are themselves joining us online, including, and if we can bring up the screen, Catherine Cano. Catherine, are you with us? We will begin with oh, there we go, fantastic. Catherine's joining us from the bottom right-hand corner there. Catherine, welcome. Catherine Cano is Professor Cano, and she teaches ethics and journalism and international development. She's been a journalist herself and served as the administrator of La Francophonie, an international organization comprised of 88 French-speaking countries around the world. Catherine is streaming to us in, I guess, from her living room, is that? In Canada. Thank you, Catherine. Also joining us is Philipp Saprykin. Mr. Saprykin is the Deputy Head of the Regional Center of the UN Secretary General for Central Asia. Thank you very much, Mr. Saprykin, for joining us. Philipp is coming to us from Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also with us today, we have Emma Chiu. Ms. Chiu is a global director at Wunderman Thompson Intelligence. And Emma, if I'm not mistaken, is joining us today from London. Hello. And finally, we have Michael Favorov. Dr. Favorov is an epidemiologist and expert in control and prevention of infectious disease spread and the president of DiaPrep system. Michael, if I am not mistaken, is coming to us from the United States.
From Atlanta.
Yeah. From Atlanta. Welcome. Very important city to me. And here in the room joining us today, we have Kazakhstan's Minister of Information and Social Development, Aida Balayeva. Aida, please join us on stage. And last but not least, Teresa Ribeiro. She is the OSCE's representative on freedom of the media who's traveled here from Portugal. Teresa, thank you very much for joining us. Minister, if you would like, I know you would like to make some remarks. If you could join here from the podium, that would be fantastic. I will take your place and then we can switch. So we'll begin with a short speech and then we shall begin our discussion. Thank you.
Distinguished participants of the forum, ladies and gentlemen, the key topic of this forum is the way the world has changed because of the pandemic. Well, the coronavirus is a new threat for the humankind. There are examples in history when there were epidemic spreading. There was anthrax and plague and others. But for the first time in the modern world, this virus became ubiquitous, and this has affected the world and various sectors of the economy, and it affected the governance as well. But the key thing is the impact of the pandemic on us, on the human beings. In the past, the face coverings and disinfectants were rare, and now everyone has it. But along with it go deeper changes in all sectors of modern life. We need to understand how it will affect us. Will it change the way we think, the behavioral stereotypes? Will it affect the consumption patterns or educational system? It's very difficult to assess these challenges and changes, so I will try to express my thoughts. First, I think that we have learned that in addition to just manufacturing, many of us can work without being tied to their offices. Basically, the humankind was able to introduce lockdowns without much damages to many sectors, but still we had many victims of the coronavirus, over 4 million people, compared to the victims of wars, and this would be much less than 1 million. Plus, the pandemic has disrupted the travel, but thanks to information technologies, we still were able to stay in touch with the outside world, and many communications became virtual, and the world was able to respond to these changes quite quickly. Whereas in December 2020, the number of users in a well-known video conference service, Zoom, was only 10 million. In March, it has already grown to 300 million, and we spent a lot of time in our homes during lockdowns, and it affected the way we consume information as well. Certainly, human beings try to find silver linings even in difficult times, and one of these silver linings is the increase in users of online information. According to Litera's platform, the demand for electronic books has grown tremendously, and as experts are mentioning, this online consumption of literature became a safety cushion for many editorial houses, but it also allowed us to bring more writers to the forefront, and the pandemic has also increased the interest of people to the TVs. During the lockdowns, the total ratings of TV channels in Kazakhstan have grown by 23%, and I'm happy to see those numbers as the Minister of Information. Third, the pandemic has affected our economy. If we look at macroeconomic indicators, globally, it shrunk by 4.3%, which is 2.5 times more than during the global financial crisis of 2009. As it turned out, the pandemic has led to a situation when the key instrument in fighting the coronavirus became the media. The mass media came to the forefront. They were interviewing experts, creating TV shows or campaigns trying to explain the strategy of the states and also to communicate the personal responsibility for staying safe. In my opinion, the mass media has gone through two stages. At first stage, it was very important to raise awareness about the lockdowns. We needed to communicate the personal safety measures and state support measures to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. And as the whole world has seen, there was a lot of uncertainty, but I still think that our mass media did well during those challenging times. Now we are experiencing the second stage. Now the key task is to raise awareness about the need to vaccinate, to ensure herd immunity. Kazakhstan today has vaccinated 60% of its population, and that is the result of well coordinated and organized work by the government bodies, but also there is a key role of the mass media played in this process. Without their impact, without their work, without the messages that they have communicated about personal protection and protecting of the families, without them, it would have been difficult to raise awareness, especially given the anti-vaxxers movements. This growth in information consumption has demonstrated that sometimes people are willing to consume a lot of information without critically assessing the benefits or harm from it. So therefore, the Ministry of Information in 2020 has created a special information resource to break down the fake information and myths that spread through the social media. Since the website was launched, we did the fact check on more than 1,500 fake news, and there were more than 15 million views of this content. But the reality is such that in the virtual world, some clickbaits are working very well, but they increase the level of anxiety in the population, and maybe that's where the popularity of various bloggers, anti-vaxxers, and conspiracy theorists comes from. They are not using some complex sentences, but they're able to grab attention of a big audience. So the primary objective of the state in this direction should be professional development and retraining of the current journalists. They should understand virtual psychology, ethics. They need to learn how to work with scientific databases. They need to be able to study memes and other virtual means of communicating information. Therefore, education and training of journalists should be up to the modern times, and we should distinguish between professional journalists and amateurs. That's why our ministry has signed MOUs with leading universities of the country to train and educate professional journalists who will specialize in certain areas: medicine, religion, law, IT. In the first half of this year, over 4,000 participants were registered for these training courses. Second, given the development of internet, the world is now facing cyberbullying problem. As any type of bullying, cyberbullying is also a type of aggression that should be prevented by the law. The ministry is now working on this aspect. We do respect the regulations for individual social medias, but at the same time we believe that the illegal content that violates the dignity and respect of an individual human being should not be kept online, because that is an important part specified in the preamble of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. Also, the pandemic has demonstrated that we see a development of humanitarian aid system being developed sporadically, but we need to pay more attention to raising awareness, to teach people on how to respect and support each other. And we need to support this culture through civic initiatives. And those civic initiatives could help in maintaining unity and cohesion in the society, as opposed to direct propaganda. Today, we have already understood that the key factor in the modern world is staying human in the age of the machines. And during the pandemic, we saw the frontline workers, healthcare professionals, law enforcement officers, but the journalists were also at the forefront. And many of them, at the same time, were volunteers. They were delivering food items or critical essential items for the people. And I can see that our media personnel is doing very well in that regard. So in the end of my speech, I would like to express my gratitude to all journalists and mass media workers for their daily efforts, for their professionalism, creativity, and certainly I would like to thank the organizers of today's forum for finding out relevant issues for the agenda. Thank you.
Well, let me start by thanking the Minister for that speech. It was actually significantly more insightful than many speeches that one hears from government officials, and so we're very grateful for that. And also very grateful for the appreciation for the government for the work of journalists. That's something that all journalists can only be delighted to hear. So thank you very much for that. And you brought up a lot of topics which we're going to continue to discuss today. So very quickly, just a quick story from me. As you may have noticed, our panel discussion today is entitled "The Pandemic, How the World Has Changed, New Vectors of Global Coexistence." And that got me thinking about the first part of the title and whether the world really has changed and how big the pandemic really is in terms of a change. How impactful really will it be? Why do I say that? Because us journalists, well, we can be tendentious. Some people know this. And so I wanted to ask the question, is it really as big of a deal as we're making it out to be? People often talk about watershed moments in history everyone remembers, right? Even as they're happening around them or maybe happening to them. For my parents' generation, that might have been the assassination of JFK. For many in my generation, that was 9/11. Last Saturday, as I was thinking about this panel and we were sitting around the dinner table, it happened to be the 20th anniversary of September 11, and I was reflecting on it in our London home. Even though I'm from the US, we live in London. And I recalled that day almost by the minute to my son. No, I wasn't at Ground Zero. I actually was a CNN reporter at the time, and I had just walked into the CNN Moscow bureau to CNN's live pictures of the World Trade Center, which had just been hit by a plane. I'll never forget. People around the world will never forget. But more than anyone, Americans, and probably Americans over the age of 35, won't forget. They remember where they were, what they were doing, what they were wearing, what they'd just eaten, how their day was going. So I asked my 18-year-old son, who Russian, American, British, what is his generation's 9/11? What is the biggest event in his life that he will never forget? He quickly pointed out a little difference between him and me. When 9/11 happened, was more or less solely American, whereas my son wears a few different hats. And he said it's not the same because he's not of one country. He doesn't have one shared national identity. And then he thought for a second, and we both answered at the same time. Without a doubt, we would argue, the biggest event in his life, and people of the younger generation's life thus far, has been the advent of this pandemic. And what is different about this pandemic from 9/11 and other events, it is, by definition, truly global. The shared experience that perhaps I had with Americans over 9/11 most is now a shared experience in the context today with the pandemic shared by everyone. And some of the implications, we're going to talk about this, well, some of the implications of the pandemic, they're endemic, right? They very well may persist for a generation or generations. Anyway, that's my personal little introduction to our conversation. I am now only going to ask questions and won't be offering, hopefully, any more opinions. That's what journalists are supposed to do. So let me begin with you, Teresa. Thank you very much for joining us. I just made a big assertion there. Did I overstate the case? Is this pandemic as big of a deal as I just suggested?
Thank you. First of all, just allow me to to express my pleasure to be here with you, to be invited, and to share my views on this big event that is the pandemic of the COVID-19. You mentioned something that I think it's very important, how long-lasting the effects of the pandemic will be. And I think this is the crucial issue. And on that, we still have to see, but at the same time, we have also to distinguish where the pandemic triggered very important changes and where the pandemic only accelerated some of the trends that were already there. And I think that mostly of the effects we are now witnessing are really a result of an acceleration of trends that were already there. And I think this maybe it's a good point to start. And when the pandemic started, I think that it raised all over the world the sensation, the feeling that we need to fight this pandemic together. It's global, it requires a global approach to overcome it. But what then happened is that because of shortage on medical supplies, we realized that we were too much dependent on global chains, supply global chains, that rendered nations unable to respond to the needs of their citizens. And this started really to accelerate nationalism. And we could see the countries fighting between them to have access to medical supplies. So nationalism is something that was really accelerated and amplified by the pandemic. But it was a trend that was already in our world. Let's not say that it was only because of the pandemic. Not at all. It was there, but it was really accelerated. And suddenly it showed completely its effects. The second thing I would like to underline is that in the first moment, we trusted science. But suddenly, we had a spread of all kinds of conspiracy theories, anti-vax movements, disinformation all around the pandemic. And this, again, was something that is a trend. It's an effect of the pandemic. It will be a long-lasting one, unfortunately, and introduces quite a big challenge within our societies. It's the lack of trust on science, the lack of trust on institutions. And this is very serious, very, very serious, and really undermines the cohesion within societies and the trust in the governance of our countries. I don't want to know if you want me to continue or you want me to stop now.
Yeah. No, you could definitely go, but let's you brought three amazing points up there.
Okay.
Let's go through those with our and get the discussion going, and definitely coming back to you.
Okay.
So those 3 points, as far as I understood, were misinformation or information and the lack of trust in people that are providing information and how that's been given birth to conspiracy theories that are a real problem going forward. Rising nationalism that was brought on in part by countries battling for resources to deal with the pandemic. And the first point was that this pandemic just didn't create problems from nowhere. In many cases, it accelerated trends or issues that were already incumbent. First off, because we have a doctor with us, Michael, I want to pick on you. One of the questions she brought up there was, we don't really know when this pandemic is going to end and where it's going. So give us the science, right? How much longer is this pandemic going to be with us? And then let's move into these other issues. And by the way, everyone is invited to jump in to the conversation without me bringing you in. I would like to encourage you to all speak with one another. Please, Michael. We're not hearing you just yet. So.
Thank you very much.
There we go.
It's wonderful to participate in such important meeting, and the timing of that meeting cannot be, as better as it is. I think I will probably switch to Russian to give our interpreters a little bit easy time, but главное, что я хочу.
The main thing I want to tell us is that everything has two sides. Globalization resulted in epidemic situations. The pests in ancient history were the results of the road development. Other infections were because somebody explored new territories, new lands, and the new viruses appeared in Europe, never before seen viruses. So it is of utmost importance for us to realize today how the medical systems will proceed to exist. The pandemic is not over yet. We do very much hope that we dispose of effective instruments to stop that terrible pandemic that is harvesting lives. Every 500th individual in the United States has fallen victim to the pandemic. This is a giant figure. I have spent 10 years working in Central Asia, being in charge of the US regional station controlling the diseases, and I can say that impacts upon Central Asia, upon Eurasia in general, are far more dramatic than in the United States of America. The main influence on the development of the epidemic is maybe controlled by instruments of clinical medicine and public health care. However, the epidemic has demonstrated that the decision-making process was pressed upon by the crisis, by influence of organized lobbies, each lobby having specific interests of its own. All the decisions in the course of epidemic are based on negotiations, but they are not based on scientific research and analysis. Even in the communicational sphere, the one that is dominating today in this platform, we think that the healthcare crisis, not successes, not achievements, but the crisis, particularly the medical crisis today, is the key topic. Globalization has increased the effectivity and the influence of informal organizations and associations. Dilettantism, non-professionalism, infantilism of anti-vaxxers, informational revolution, particularly informational revolution in the times of pandemic when we try to avoid any contacts, resulted in the strengthening of the network structures. Very often we are not aware of those structures. Various medical experts, fake news producers, conspirology theoreticians, people who avail themselves of healthcare problems to distribute some fake news, people reporting about whatsoever. The group interests, unfortunately, very often were dominating compared to the interests of scientific circles. So, drawing the resume, I wanted to say that the political element of healthcare has significantly increased in the times of pandemic in all the countries, starting from the United States of America and ending with any Eurasian country. As was said by Otto von Bismarck, policy is the art of the possible. Politics is the art of the possible. To improve healthcare, we need, as physicians, as epidemiology people, be better aware of political mechanisms.
We have 55 minutes left in this conversation. We are actually already a third done, and we have a lot of topics to cover, and we have a lot of people that want to participate in it. So I would ask, dear panelists, and this is not singling you out, Michael, if we could please make our comments a bit quicker, then we can make this a little bit more interactive. Catherine, I want to come to you. What do you make of Teresa's argument, her second point there, that the battle for resources spawned a new wave of nationalism in the world? The second part of our title, as I'm sure you noticed, is called New Vectors of Global Coexistence. There's this sense that the pandemic that we heard from Teresa has ushered in a shift away from globalization towards isolation. Is that what's going on? Give us the view from Canada.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you from Canada tonight. Tonight for me, but today for you.
Yes.
That's a very good question, and I really appreciate what the other speaker said, because it rings true to me. I think what we can say is the pandemic has been a real political stress test, a global political stress test. I mean, the biggest crisis since the financial crisis of 2008. So globalization, has made us more interconnected and interdependent. But the pandemic exposed the risk of such interconnection and interdependency. You're right, this nationalism that came, but because, we had to protect the people, and borders were closed, the travel was stopped. Suddenly everybody was fighting effectively to get the supplies that were in shortage. I remember I was with the International Organization for la Francophonie, and we had to find our masks, get our mask and sanitizer from countries from Africa, of all places, because there was none in France, as the headquarters was based in France. So it was amazing to see how ill prepared the world was to face such a crisis. So everybody had to rethink their reliance on other countries and now trying to figuring out how to become more self-sufficient. So it did provoke this isolation that I don't think was necessarily was so present at the time, but there was no choice in a way, and it shows also to me the importance of leadership and the fact that international leadership is necessary in times like that, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this crisis. When you think about it, and Dr. Michael was mentioning it, is that you needed the old world to actually get together and put themselves into a solution mode, but instead you saw, for instance, in the United States, a real sense of trying to focus on domestic and making sure their people were fine. They withdraw money from WHO, which was definitely the wrong thing to do, and did not contribute. I mean, they had too many doses of vaccine, but refused to send it places in the world where it was needed. So it was already in that process of focusing on themselves, but the crisis really made it even more. The decisions of President Trump at the time was to really focus on the U.S., but also dismissing the science and dismissing the importance. So the result of it was terrible for the U.S. Michael was mentioning it. It's so many deaths, people that got ill and died because of misinformation. So I think the globalization really got a hit, because even with President Biden now, he's mentioned America is back, and that they were gonna, they want to take their place back, and they have been involved with international organization and have signed agreement, and really is now sending vaccines to other countries, doses of vaccine to other countries. But it's a different kind of being back. I mean, the president is not screaming America first, but definitely there is a new approach in foreign policy, and a new approach even with its neighbor. I mean, Canada is the biggest friend, the biggest ally, the biggest trade partner, and we've had issues with more trade dispute, and even on the COVID crisis, we Americans are allowed in Canada, but Canadians are not allowed in the U.S. So it's a very different relationship between countries. It's me first and looking out second. At some point, maybe there was no choice at the beginning because we had to be protective, but now I think the world needs a global solution and involvement from all the countries. There's no doubt that there's no way around it.
Thank you very much. Emily, I want to come to you in Europe for a second and ask you if this issue of isolation or nationalism, are you seeing that in Europe, sitting in London? Sort of Brexit preceded, of course, the pandemic, but maybe the spats between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe and the European Union haven't come to an end. Is that something you're seeing? And also, if you wouldn't mind talking about what many people are saying, the biggest geopolitical issue right now, Emily, and that's the relationship between the United States, or between China and the United States. Emily. I think there we are.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, it's Ryan. Sorry, it's Emma. That's why I got a bit confused.
Oh. Apologies.
No worries. So yes, there's a lot of tension that's happening in the UK, because we're not only dealing with the political issues that are ushering because of the pandemic, we're also dealing with a lot of political issues prior, Brexit, and all the global implications that's happening that we're still figuring out and trying to understand. I'm situated in London, which is a very key capital that's very international. And even now, as I go about London, it feels very different, not because of the pandemic, but because of Brexit. And these things are becoming more intertwined. The way people are behaving is also very different here as well. But we're having a lot of people feeling quite stressed. So I think we're starting to notice different types of communities trying to really come together at this time to almost help support and be there for each other at this still very complex and confusing time. So I think we're still at a time when things are uncertain. That word is very prominent during the last year and a half, this sense of uncertainty that people are feeling, and therefore leading to the sense of anxiety, how to plan for the future. This is becoming more and more complex. And it was interesting hearing your story earlier, Ryan, about your son's sense of place in the world, because he comes from a very multicultural background. And we're starting to hear people question that as well. Where is the sense of place as this globalization is becoming more localized. How do people feel? Where do people feel comfortable? And I think this is a key defining point where people are figuring that out. And I forget your second point that you mentioned where you brought in China.
Has the pandemic changed anything? Is it going to influence the relationship between the United States and China one way or another?
I think well, the relationship between the US and China has always been complex.
Yeah.
And I think, as Teresa has mentioned, there's a lot of trends that were already in place and it's just accelerated because of the pandemic. And I think these trends that we saw earlier where it comes to the relationships will be accelerating because of the pandemic. There's going to be more pressure on China, which we're starting to see, not just words that's being exchanged, but actually things being done and put in place to put a bit more pressure on them. We'll see a little bit more of that.
Thank you. Philipp, if I could bring you in, thank you for joining us from Ashgabat. How concerned are you about this shift from what was kind of a global party, sometimes it felt like, before the pandemic, to where we are now, where perhaps, as Teresa was beginning, things feel a little bit more kind of nationalistic?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, Ryan, and Philips, sorry. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
So I would like to reduce the volume of my speakers. Well, if you don't mind, well, I would speak Russian because I have prepared my analysis and
Мы только приветствуем, если
my
хотите,
presentation
Yes, please.
on how the regional center was dealing with pandemic and what are the Central Asian countries did and how the things went over the recent 1.5 years. So if you don't mind, I will turn over to Russian.
Пожалуйста.
Distinguished colleagues, first of all, in my today's presentation, I would like to talk also about what our regional center does in Central Asia and the way it is supporting the cooperation between the countries in line with its mandate, which was given to us by the UN Security Council. And the Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy in Central Asia is something that is very important for the region and for the agenda. We are trying to respond to extremism, to respond to national priorities, especially in the pandemic. Also, we deal with the issues of women empowerment. All of these topics are very important. And these were all the priority matters during the pandemic as well. But if we talk overall about the UN, I think that these last 2 years were difficult and they brought many changes and we needed to adapt to the new conditions. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the UN at first has offered a way to help countries in responding in a quick and efficient manner. In the beginning of the crisis already, UN General Secretary made a call for global cooperation. There was also a report on global solidarity and common responsibility. And the response fund was created. Lately, these tools have become even more important. In 2020, there was an initiative of the decade to accelerate the work to ensure sustainable development, and UN General Secretary also made a call to focus on human rights protection and fight against discrimination. I just wanted to quote what the Secretary General has mentioned. He said that we now have an understanding that international cooperation is the path to a more inclusive, sustainable post-pandemic world. And the old norms of inequality and unfairness should be eliminated. And I fully agree with that. Now let me say a few words about the response in Central Asia. You will remember that there are 5 countries of Central Asia that have supported all of the initiatives to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic and to join the international effort to mitigate the negative impacts of the pandemic. There are many examples of the kind of support in the region that included regular contacts on various levels, including the highest political level. For instance, Kazakhstan has provided humanitarian aid to Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan. Turkmenistan has provided humanitarian aid to Iran and Afghanistan in turn. And many countries have provided support to Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So, for instance, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have rendered their support as well in 2020. In addition to humanitarian aid, the donor countries also try to maintain the transit corridors open, streamlined the border crossing procedures to ensure the delivery of essential goods, medical equipment, food. There was also an uninterrupted supply of electricity. And these are just a few examples of the kinds of support that was rendered also with the participation of the UN. In terms of our center's work, given our mandate and the objectives established by the UN, we continued to provide comprehensive support and maintain dialogue between the countries of the region on the highest level. Ms. Natalia German, representative of Central Asia, despite the lockdown measures, she was still able to visit the countries, establish some consultations and meetings. In 2020, the regional center has organized 2 meetings between the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of Central Asia and Afghanistan. During these meetings, the countries had opportunities to discuss the cooperation issues in these challenging times. This included the response to the current crisis and also possible response measures to any future crisis in the region. I also wanted to point out that the 5 countries have identified the following areas of cooperation. These are transit, transport corridors. They have underlined the importance of cooperation in the healthcare sector in strengthening the mechanisms of cooperation there. And they noted that despite the COVID-19 pandemic, there are still other regional challenges. They haven't gone anywhere. And these include many aspects, including counterterrorism. The countries also emphasized the fact of the need to ensure equality of women, young people. And I should say that the level of interaction between the regional center and the governments of the region during the pandemic has become even more intensive, and the cooperation between the countries in the last 2 years has become even more intensive. If there is still some time left, I could maybe talk some more about the other topics of cooperation between the countries of the region. But maybe with that, I will stop and give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting talking about Afghanistan there. We heard a reference from Catherine to Afghanistan and the United States shifting policy with President Biden now in charge, and interesting to hear about regional cooperation given what appears to be a little bit of a retreat from the United States from foreign policy, maybe a retreat that was brought on at least in part by COVID, or as Teresa was suggesting, perhaps accelerated by COVID. It was already a trend that was in place. I want to move on to a slightly different subject, but one that we all take very seriously here at the Eurasian Media Forum, being journalists, and that's the subject of information or misinformation. And before I dive into it, I want to point out that at 4:30 today, we are going to have a fantastic conversation about just that. So stay by. That's 4:30 Nur-Sultan time. We will hear all about how information is being manipulated and how to correct the situation. But I want to talk about information, obviously, in the context of the pandemic. And Catherine, I want to come to you. You know, sometimes it feels like it's difficult to get a straight answer to many of the questions that the pandemic has thrown up. Questions like, you know, some people, as we understand, are struggling with, should they get vaccinated? Should they not get vaccinated? They should get vaccinated. I'll just throw that in there. If they are going to get vaccinated, what vaccine should they get? Can they mix the vaccines? How does the disease spread? Do we have a problem with information now in this pandemic and misinformation?
Well, that's such a great question. Yes, we do, because there's been what we call the infodemic now, an overdose, an overabundance of information, some good information, obviously, and I know organizations have tried so hard with that firsthand, but there's also been lots of falsehoods and unfounded rumors and speculation, and that would mislead citizens and governments and leaders and make it harder to actually figure out what are the true facts and actually who and what to trust. I have to say that we all, I think, been impacted by that. Everybody we know in terms of like which vaccine is good, not good, should we mix them, not mix them. And the thing is, social media, the spread of information, and when it's a misinformation, it goes so fast and it reaches so many people. It's really hard to undo an information that's out there. And the problem with the misinformation on something that's related to public health and about a pandemic like this one is it could be potentially harmful and endanger the health of populations. So this is serious matters. I know there's been huge efforts by media, by the WHO, by tons of governments, tons of organizations to try to control that. But, you know, Africa, for instance, seen a deluge of COVID-19 falsehood. I mean, there was in May, you maybe remember that in Kenya, when there were false claims of vaccines affecting the menstrual cycle, and it started to circulate online. It was crazy, and it took forever to actually try to debunk that. But for many, they didn't go get the vaccine because they were afraid of that. So it's big. It's a big issue. And the question I have is what can the role of WHO be in terms of guiding even more strongly countries, because we've seen the same science, but interpreted differently in different countries. And it's really a problem when you're trying to figure out what is the truth. I mean, is mixing the vaccines a problem? In the US, it is a problem. In other parts of the world, no, it's not a problem. But you're playing with people's lives. So how can, and I understand the countries are sovereign, but could an international organization like WHO has the expertise on that, have more of power in terms of directing and strongly suggesting that and they try to do it, but it's still up to the countries to decide, and I think that is something that is it is wrong. And then when you have leaders that the former administration in the U.S. Communicating misinformation about vaccines and the pandemic, even denying basically it happened. The result is you got more people that died. You got more restrictions to try to control the spread, which had an impact on the economy because they closed restaurants, they closed businesses, and on people's mental and physical health and well-being. Yeah. So this needs leadership again, to me, and it's a tough fight. It's a tough fight.
Okay, 2 seconds. We've got lots of questions coming in from our online participants. I think you just threw up a lot of issues there that I want our panelists to respond to. But first, we have a question from our online participants that Sue is going to communicate to us now. Sue, please.
Thank you, Ryan. Just to let you know that if the audience also would like to ask questions, there are volunteers who will be coming round with microphones for you to ask those questions. But we now have the first online question, and this is posed to Michael Favorov. How do you assess the likelihood that given the constant mutation of the coronavirus, the quarantine will never end? And part 2 of this question, is there a chance that COVID-19 will become a seasonal flu-like illness and a new super virus will take its place?
Doctor.
Let me answer the second question first. Definitely this type of corona will be with us forever from now, but I don't think it will be epidemic virus because besides of this one, we already have 20 different coronaviruses circulating in our population, and it's so a light disease that we're not actually worried about. That's in terms of continuation of the virus circulation. In terms of mutation, the question is very difficult to answer, but to say things easy, first of all, virus will try to adapt itself to us by the mechanism which is known to be in the nature for millions of years, and sooner or later that virus become much less dangerous, much less damaging, much less and much easier to circulate. That's what usually happens with viruses. So as my prediction, and I published this model several times, the 23 we will meet the new year without mask. That's what I'm saying. let's leave to the 23.
Thank you very much. Emma, if I could pick on you for a second. The doctor was pretty clear there with his information. You heard Catherine there say the WHO, who's supposed to be leading the way, has not always been so clear. Do you agree with Catherine, or is she being too hard on the WHO?
I think it's a lot of pressure to put on the WHO. It's really something that we've been talking about as part of my group. Is we always look to key consumer trends and key trends happening culturally. And we've definitely seen a huge shift from this sense of like me to we, like how we're trying to get together to really solve this pandemic and this issue and all the issues that kind of come along with the pandemic. And there is this sense of a cultural we movement of coming together and collaborating. And of course, there are the sort of offshoots of that not happening as well. But I do think there is, I'm always more of an optimist, and I think the way we always try to look at humanity and trends in this sense is to see the more positive side of it. And it's not down to one single organization to, issue out positive and accurate information. It needs to come as a collective. And trust is a huge thing that has come up in what we've been studying and looking at. And when we run a lot of surveys, consumer surveys around the world, trust in government is really, really low at the moment. So when the government is telling you to wear masks, to stay at home, people just don't want to listen to them. And I think we need to figure out a way, how can trust in authoritative figures be put back in place? Where is trust kind of channeling to at the moment, especially with the younger generation? And quite interestingly, they are looking at friends and family, they're looking at sources, multiple sources. So they're not just going through one news outlet, they're looking at multiple news outlets, big and small, to kind of gather their information and then come to a more accurate and, opinion that they will gather themselves. And I think as all these channels kind of come together, we will figure out a way to kind of gather trust again. And if it is in the WHO, if it is going to be in the healthcare system, or we're currently seeing quite a lot of larger companies rise in the ranks when it comes to trust, surprisingly, that they have a key role to play in issuing the right information, and also not only issuing the right information, but to act upon things that are inaccurate as well. So, for example, there's a lot of pressure on Facebook at the moment to bring down fake news. So this is like, there's multiple things at play, and I think everyone has a role to play, even individuals.
Interesting. I thought it was me to, Catherine, please.
No, I was going to say I totally agree with Emma, and I think I didn't mean that to be mean on the WHO. On the contrary, I think the states, the countries can totally trust the experts, and I think what was more my point was the fact that countries were kind of deciding for themselves to either follow the lead or not follow the lead, when in fact you have all those experts around. They're actually doing the data and gathering the information. And leadership, it's an international leadership. So I totally agree that it's collaborative, and it has to be, it's so many people are involved. And you bring up Facebook, and I think, Emma, and I think it's one of the, social media have been a key player in helping or not helping the situation.
It would be really interesting, this idea of the movement from me to we, and what that might mean for the WHO, but also solving other problems. I mean, at 4:30 we're going to have a panel discussion about the environment. I can't imagine 4:30 p.m. Nur Sultan time. I can't imagine a more important area for the world to go from me to we than when it comes to tackling climate change. And that's obviously going to be, we're going to see, there's going to be a test of that at COP26 in November in Scotland, when world leaders gather. I want to come over to you, Teresa, because you wanted to jump in there. And then, Aida, I have a question for you. Please, Teresa.
Okay. Allow me just to briefly comment.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, please, yeah.
Okay. Briefly comment some of what has been said.
Yeah.
One thing is about international cooperation, the importance of international cooperation. This is key. This is key because, unfortunately, the pandemic will tend to have a big impact in a dramatic way on the gains that we had in the past years with globalization. And this will be terrible to widen the inequalities between the rich North and the global South, with terrible implications in the geopolitical stage. So this is something that we should be aware of. The second one that I would like also to comment in is that the harm caused by misinformation and disinformation. It's terrible. It really harms cohesion within society. It harms the trust on our institutions, and it has a huge impact also on the safety of journalists, unfortunately. What we see right now is that in public gatherings of the anti-vax public gatherings, we see journalists attacked, not as in the past by officials, but by the public, by the demonstrators. And this is new. And this is really a big, big challenge for the safety of journalists. And this is very much my concern as representative on freedom of the media. But I think this is a trend. It's a very dangerous one because it's linked again with distrust. It's all fake news. Journalists only tell lies. We should not trust them. So let's attack them. We had this terrible event on the Capitol. We all remember quite well journalists attacked, and not only journalists, but institutions too. So all the elements and all the dangerous elements were there. And this is really so much magnified by the pandemic that deserves our attention. Thank you.
Thank you. And Aida, I wanted to ask you, you are our only politician participating in this conversation. You're the Minister of Information. It must have been challenging over this last year and a half, with so much disinformation out there, to communicate with people and provide, at least as far as you understood, the most truthful information you could.
Yes, in my report, I told about the measures we are taking in our ministry, and I do join the rest of the speakers by saying that realistically, pandemic has changed the world, changed ourselves. So consequently, today we observe that all governments have turned into more client-oriented forces acting for the benefit of the society. So today, like never before, we have a common enemy. That's the virus, and unfortunately, the virus is not going to retreat. Our imperative task is to struggle. The virus struggle, the disinformation and misinformation. I strongly believe that we must unite effort and design some new measures for struggle. I am happy that today's society, like never before, has appreciated the importance of versatile, accurate information. I join Teresa, I join the other speakers in their emphasis on the importance of help to journalists, and it was quite interesting in your report when you were saying about a lot of information coming from not traditional but untraditional sources of information. How do you struggle that? Well, it is clear that we must strengthen the public awareness campaigns and clarification activity. Pretty much depends upon the professionalism of the journalistic community itself. It is important to refer to the opinions of experts, to people who are scientifically substantiated by science. And of course, a lot of things are still to be done.
Thank you very much. Was about how journalists are on occasion being attacked because they're trying to share what they believe to be truthful information that some people don't agree with. I wonder also about this thing that people talk about, which is the polarization of news organizations. And if we're even seeing that when it comes to COVID, I want to go to Catherine quickly about that. Emma, if you want to chime in, but Teresa, if you just briefly could speak to that, that would be fantastic. But briefly, please.
Yeah, well, I think you do see the polarization, unfortunately, and it's, you see it. I mean, I'm living next to the United States, so it's it's something that's hard to escape.
Yeah.
And it's damaging because it's the problem is there are a lot of in an information, there's a lot of gray zone, right? Nothing is necessarily true or untrue or right or wrong. It's some, it depends on a lot of things. So there's a little less context given to, and I think we need more context now and more explanations. And it's, and one of the biggest issue is that now you almost, and even politicians do that, divide the population. You're against or in favor, you're against it or in favor of it. When in fact you got to educate. I think the one thing we lesson learned is we need to communicate as much as possible. We need to control or debunk the falsehood, but also educate people as much as possible. And it takes time. Got to be patient. But I think it's very needed because polarization is not a good place to go.
Yeah. Emma, I saw you nodding your head. You're there you go.
Yeah, I realize.
Yeah, that's okay.
I totally agree with Catherine. Like, education is a huge, is really what's going to be very important. There was an article that was out with the title, how will we be teaching our future generations about this pandemic? And I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine, and the friend said, what would be scarier is if we don't teach a future generation about this pandemic, which I completely agree. And it's really about education. We need to learn from what has happened and really find ways to prevent something like this from happening in the future. But going back to your point in terms of polarization of, news outlets, I was living in New York for the past 5 years, only hopped back over to London in the recent months. And news in the States is hugely polarized, and it causes a lot of divide, misinformation, and people just flat out distrust certain news outlets. The other thing that I notice is a lot of reputable and respected news outlets, a lot of the information are behind paywalls as well, which is preventing people from having access to good news sources and lengthier journalism. So there's a slightly complicated thing with journalism where it's on one hand, information at the moment is kind of a free-for-all, but really respected and true journalism, it costs money. So how are we going to figure that part out? So I think there's a few elements that, and I'm sure, Ryan, you probably have a perspective on this as well, coming from journalism, but it's quite a complex thing that we need to solve in terms of the type of journalism that we're putting out there, information. I know the New York Times is making all of their COVID information accessible for everyone, but how can we, keep up this sort of accuracy of journalism so people just have free access to it?
Yeah, because what's free is Facebook and Twitter and their echo chambers. We have another question from our online participants. Please keep them coming. We have another just 10 minutes. This has been a fantastic chat, but we do want you to come with your questions. Sue, please.
This is the second question from online. The pandemic has shown that traditional media cannot compete in terms of information speed with fake news and social networks. How do journalists work during the infodemic?
Teresa, please.
Again, Catherine talked about, and she really underlined the importance of education. This is very important. And I also would like to add media literacy, fact-checking, good journalists. These are all important elements for the readers, for the audiences to understand the value of journalism, to understand the value of a good information. So I would say that this is key. Of course, the problem is that these are long-term investments. And how can you find the right responses right now with what need to be done in the long term? This is much more complicated, and unfortunately, I don't know, the silver bullet is not very visible for me. But I think one important is to have sound legal environment to protect media freedom and to protect journalists. This is very important. Second, politicians and officials need to abstain to have irresponsible behavior. This is very important too. If they don't lead by the example, if we don't have good leaderships, of course we cannot trust institutions, we cannot trust science. You know, one of the most important conquests of humankind was division of labor. I do not want to study medicine to trust my doctor. Of course not. But I need to trust him to be sure that all the information I get, all the treatments I get from him are okay. So once again, it's not to put everyone knowing everything about pandemic, it's restoring trust. I would say that restoring trust is maybe the most important investment we can do. And for that, there is a lot of elements to be mobilized. Thank you.
Thank you. We can't talk about the pandemic and not talk about the socio-economic effects of it. We don't have very much time, so we'll be very brief. And if you could be brief with your answers, I'd be grateful. Look, a lot of money has gone into the system. Countries trying to, on the one hand, enforce quarantines over the last year and a half, but also keep their economies on life support and prepare them for the world after. In the UK where I live, we just learned taxes are going up. So the reckoning is just about to begin, I reckon, if I can use reckon twice in a sentence. Emma, I'm going to do a little bit of profiling here. You look like the youngest member of the youngest of the panelists. This feels a little bit like a little generational thing, i.e. the older generations are the stock market's doing okay, taxes have been low, debt's piling up, guess who's going to pay? Is that going to be an issue?
Absolutely, and I think there's a reason why, we've been running a very extensive, reports and surveys on the younger generation, Gen Z, which a lot of my teams and clients are really keen to learn more about, because they are rightfully anxious about the future. They do believe that COVID-19 and climate change are two pivotal things that are really defining their generation. And the way it will dictate their future, what they'll be studying, the types of jobs they'll be deciding to go into. They need this sense of stability, which I think millennials perhaps didn't need to worry so much about. So if you think about millennials, stereotypically, they probably moved into education, chose education that they liked. They just enjoyed that subject. Whereas this younger generation, they're choosing, topics or going straight into work that has a sense of stability and has a sense of future in it. So I do think it is going to really impact the younger generations. We have yet to find out what it will mean for Gen Alphas. And I think, again, we go back to this it all comes back to how we putting our faith and trust in the government, or are we going to roll up our sleeves and think about we want to join the government and we want to make change? So I think the younger generation are looking towards doing that.
Yeah, Michael, if I could, Emma used the word anxious there. Just briefly, I want you to speak about the mental health issues. Are you concerned? You know, everyone's talking about how one of the big social impacts of this pandemic is that it just has been really unsettling for huge numbers of people's mental health. Is this an issue?
Yes, that's quite significant issue. Besides, we have direct impact of the virus among survivors, especially the people who had a significant manifestation of the disease. Unfortunately, isolation, unfortunately, the feeling of like a poor involvement and detached of the group. And I mean, yes, the simple answer, we still have to work to have more data on that, but you're right, that will be significant issue to adjust our information to the new reality with the many questions which we never faced before.
Catherine, if I could bring it back to you for a moment, on the economic front, you know, there's a lot of talk about how the services industries have been devastated, the rise of tech. Mr. Bezos, nowadays the owner of Amazon, worth a lot of money, more than most countries. Are you concerned about where we're headed economically speaking? And just because we only have 4 minutes, where's the silver lining? There must be a silver lining in this, please.
Of course there is. Of course there is.
Well, start with the negative and then go into why this is all actually going to work out for us, and we're going to come out stronger.
Yeah, well, listen, it's for sure that as the economy is getting hurt big time, and you're talking about, you know, we're in a transformational time, and it's already been happening, but the COVID had brought a lot of deaths. People have invested a lot of money, but you know, the governments have keep spending money just because they have to, you know, buy vaccines, you know, build infrastructure, make sure that, you know, adapt to the crisis. But on the other hand, I think, yes, you're right. I mean, some industries have really been hit hard, but you've got the digital economy who's blossomed. You have a lot of creativity and innovation during that time. I mean, and I go back to what Teresa said. Another element that's been accelerated, it was already there, was that the technology transformation, the fact that we were already heading, all industry were actually impacted by the changes with what AI is bringing with, you know, robotization. So we were already into, you know, doing this transition to digital and to new technology. Now it did accelerate, the pandemic did accelerate that. And, you know, when I was at the OIF, I mean, it helped in many ways because we did in 3 weeks, we thought we'd take 2 years, and then we saved tons of money with being able to communicate and connect differently, and we're able to put that money back into programs for populations in French Africa, Francophone countries in Africa and other places. So I think there are opportunities, and people are sized the moment as well. But it is the silver lining to me is that I think it will change the economy. But it will not necessarily. At the end of the day, it just needs to be a lot more training, reskilling, and making sure we're actually we're following our people. I think the people, the staff, the well-being of people is going to be as important for an economy to be strong.
Thank you very much. Well, we've tried now in just an hour and a half to discuss what we've spent the last year and a half of our lives discussing in many cases in our own homes and our own kitchens in lockdown. At least in the United Kingdom, that was the case for my family for much of the time. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I am very grateful for your participation. And I would highly recommend you stick around for the 2 more discussions we're going to have today about information, again, in a broader context, not just when it comes to COVID, and also about the environment, which we touched on here, perhaps the greatest challenge going forward of our generation and generations going beyond, maybe even an existential question, as we now all understand. Let me thank our panelists, beginning with Philipp Saprykin, Deputy Head of the Regional Center of the UN, for the UN Secretary General of Central Asia. Philipp, thank you so much for joining us from Ashgabat. Emma Chiu, joining us from London, Global Director at Wunderman Thompson Intelligence. Thank you. Michael Favorov, the Dr. Favorov is an epidemiologist, an expert in control and prevention of infectious diseases, gave us some pretty straight answers, which we were all craving and have been craving for the last 18 months. Thank you very much. Catherine Cano, Professor Cano, teacher of ethics and journalism, something I think we all highlighted is super important. And of course, here in the room, Teresa Ribeiro, I'm sure I didn't get that quite right, OSCE representative freedom of the media, with some very important messages about the importance of journalism and the protection of journalists. For that, we are very grateful. And last but not least, of course, Kazakhstan's Minister of Information and Social Development, Aida Balayeva. Rahmet. Thank you. All right, until our next panel discussion. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
So, of course, a big thank you to Ryan and his panelists again there. A reminder, you can send questions and comments in through the online facility if you're watching online, and through the app. And those attending in person can ask questions as well. Please do raise your hand and you can actually ask questions. Lunch is going to be now, and it's going to be, for those of you attending here, in the Artsy Cafe on the 1st floor. If you need help, volunteers can advise you. See you promptly at 2:30, please.